Previously on Winter Kingdom by Aakash Sharma. Staring back at me was my own self, naked and with a tiny, empty hole in my forehead. A line of blood went down fresh and warm, as if it waited for me to get a look first. I opened my mouth to scream, horrified at the sight of whatever it was that I had become. But all I saw was a gaping maw, empty, devoid of light, and stretched to disturbing proportions. I was supposed to be a little girl. I was supposed to be young, younger than even my brother who sat next to my aunt. But looking at myself in that mirror, I was much older, almost the same age that my aunt was. I turned back to face my reflection, but jumped, startled by the eyes of a cat staring back at me. Its eyes shone white, with hints of red in them. Cats are very sensitive creatures. They see and feel things that we don't. I felt a man's words that I might have heard before from one of the lives I had lived. A man who had been my husband once. A man who was... I placed a hand on my bare stomach. I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel rage. I just felt cold. I heard a young boy scream and turned to find Dan staring right at me, screaming. I wanted to say something, but as I opened my mouth, blood leaked from my nose and my forehead more profusely, somehow flowing into my mouth and choking my words. I forced myself to be still and dropped on the floor, curling up. The young boy, my brother, had been screaming at the cat at the window. He hadn't even noticed my presence. The cat continued to stare down at me until I saw Aunt Greta tap lightly on the window, after which it jumped away. She then went back to my brother, who was having a meltdown, to comfort him. And then, the last life I had lived started coming back to me. The same man, the man who had been my husband once, had told me a story. A story about a witch and a king. A story with ice, winter, and skinned people. I heard his voice once again, continuing with the story. The king was convinced of his victory and went down to offer the witch his terms. He offered to take her skin away, and her pain, her fear, and her suffering. After he was done, he glanced upon the now skinned witch, who held a huge grin on her face. She had one final trick to play. With ancient spells, the skinned witch burned her flesh, disappearing into another world, Jim said, finishing his story. I didn't exist anymore. Billy stood next to his car in the freezing cold. He was uneasy at first, but he had seen enough tonight to know that what he was about to do would not be an act of a deranged lunatic. To everyone else, he would appear to be a homicide detective, standing alone by his car and taking the edge off from tonight, after the nightmare that he had witnessed. A nightmare that had confirmed that he was, in fact, dealing with something beyond this world. All I could do was wait and watch. If I could still feel like I used to, I supposed that I would feel anxious, but I was way past that now. He couldn't see me, at least not in the traditional sense. To say that I didn't exist anymore doesn't feel like the most accurate way of putting it, but it wasn't far from the truth. I wasn't Ellen Vale Kemper anymore. The real Ellen Vale Kemper had been in a car with her husband, James Kemper. She was confused and scared, but also managed to keep herself restrained. Jim, unknown to Ellen, was a pawn in this sick game that had gone on for far too long, and Jim had broken the rules. He had fallen in love with the one that he was supposed to kill. Billy wasn't supposed to be here, but if he wasn't, he would be a dead man. The whole town had gone crazy tonight, and the remaining ones who still had their sanity questioned it. Billy was one of those. Almost an hour after Ellen drove by, the wailing sirens of fire trucks should have succeeded the police sirens that were going around when there were various reports of disturbances coming from all over town. The police had found, or rather didn't find, the victims. Only their spouses. If they were alive, and if they did happen to be alive, there was nothing left of their sanity. One could only imagine what they had witnessed that scared them so badly enough to break them. The missing children had returned to their parents the day before, but tonight, they had disappeared once again, taking one of their parents each with them. The house that Ellen had spent most of her childhood in had plenty of good memories. Memories that, if I thought of now, were a mere reminder of the fact that I couldn't smile to them. But then, after Ellen's mother had died in that house, all those memories became foggy under a cloud of grief. That house was burning down. The firemen wouldn't respond to the situation, and neither would the police anymore. Things that had been set in motion years ago had finally taken effect. The townspeople, alive or dead regardless, would sleep the deepest sleep that they ever had tonight. A car came crawling into view, coming from the direction of the burnt house. And this was it. Billy took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come, and then he stepped out of the car, concealing his fear behind a look of determination. He gestured far away from the car to stop, but he knew that it wouldn't, not if what he had dreamt had been right. All I could do was wait for the future to unfold. A curious cat made its way down to observe my presence, despite the cold. I wasn't surprised. As I locked eyes with the creature, thoughts about the past and the things I did leading up to this began to flow through my memories. The things that began from the feeling of the bullet stuck between my eyes and the coldness of death. I was Ellen once, but that night, all those years ago after my death, I wasn't Ellen anymore. I didn't know that yet. Not while I was curled up, naked, sitting in my Aunt Greta's living room, watching my older brother, who was 6 or 7 at the time, having a meltdown after being spooked by a cat peering in through the window. I was drowning in senselessness. I just wanted to know if I was dead or not. If this was heaven or hell. I wanted to know. It was the not knowing that scared me the most. I couldn't speak. Every time I tried, I would drown from my own blood. I waited and waited, watching younger selves of my family in the room, oblivious to my presence in there, but seeing myself, I was glad that they were. The telephone began to ring, and Aunt Greta, trying and failing to console a panicked Dan, left him to it and answered it. Her face lit up as soon as she heard the voice on the other line. She called Dan to the phone, who was still a mess, and then she called him again. "You've become a big brother, Dan," she said. "Don't cry now. You've got a baby sister." Aunt Greta drove Dan to the hospital. He had calmed down somewhat by now, but she was still taking him to his parents the first chance that she got. She was never the best with children, but I liked her. I was alone, staring out the window where the cat had peered through. What I saw there didn't look right. It seemed to be dark. It wasn't like the window had been covered from the outside. It seemed impossible anyway, after having seen the cat. But the darkness wasn't flat. It was writhing and crawling. It was almost as if it was alive. It was welcoming as I gave it my hand. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. It was like coming home. I found myself curled up in another corner. This time, a corner I was familiar with, but I couldn't be sure. Maybe now, I was finally awake from that terrible nightmare. from whatever that had been. I stepped out of the dark corner and next to the door of my old house, the house I grew up in whenever I was Ellen Vale. I heard a creak in the distance and crawled my way into the room behind me, my parents' old room. It was dark, and nobody was in there. I remembered that Dan and my Aunt Greta hadn't seen me, but for some reason I still felt compelled to hide myself, to hide this monstrosity that I found myself becoming. My old memories, my old life, nothing seemed to matter now. All that matters was what was next. I knew that every answer that I wanted was somewhere I knew, and it was whispering, scratching at the door to be let out. In that darkness, things flashed around in my mind. I was in places that I couldn't have been. I saw my father, a younger man with his head on my mother's lap. She looked on to him with a smile. "See?" I heard my mother's voice for the first time in so many years, and I felt something writhe within me. Was that sorrow? "Nothing to be afraid of," she said, and caressed his face. My dad, a man who had always maintained an image of invulnerability, started ahead, away from my mother into the darkness. Things that need to hide in the dark would never be as strong as you are. That's what my mother said anyways. My mother said to him. "Sharon, he tried to say. "Just look." She said it, and he obeyed, staring into the dark. "Do you see something? Do you feel it?" How long ago was this? Judging by the way they looked, they weren't even married yet. There was no ring in sight anyways. I would call out to her. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I didn't need to anyway. She looked at me as though she could see me. But unlike my father, who seemed to be afraid of the dark all these years back, she didn't seem afraid. Instead, she looked me up and down and smiled. "There's nothing scary about the dark," she said to him. I faded to another time, another place. A boy lay awake in his bed. The dorm room was decorated with movie posters. He was about 18 or 19, and he lay indifferent to the dark, staring up at the ceiling. I hadn't seen him this young anywhere except for in pictures. Jimmy. I placed my hand on his feet, and he abruptly pulled his feet back and sat upright. He heard me say it, even though I didn't. He felt my words through my touch. Is that how I could talk to him? Is that how it worked in this dream or whatever it was? I reached down to touch him again. "Jimmy, I need your help. Jimmy began to panic. He went to turn on the lights immediately. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jimmy, you must listen to me." I felt a strong force pulling me back, something that was much stronger than whatever had brought me here. I felt like I was waking up, and my touch on Jimmy loosened. I tried to tell him who I was, though I doubted he would understand as my touch finally left him, and I, in my desperation, spoke through my tongue, my words gargling with blood. "Ellen Vale. Find Ellen." And then, back to the familiar darkness of my old house, back to my parents' old room. Anything that I would have felt before seemed distant now. My heart grew colder and darker. The more time went by, the darkness grew more excited. It was as if it was desperate to whisper those secrets that it held. It wanted me to know, but it didn't know how. Was I ever even Ellen? Who was I if not? And there, sitting in the darkness, I felt hints of what may be called despair and helplessness. Maybe an eternity would pass this way. My hands seemed to grow older than the rest of me, and I imagined that soon they would just fall off, and I would sit here, decaying in the dark for the rest of time. That was until I heard the song. It was something I was vaguely familiar with, though I don't really know what it was. The voice humming the song was female, a voice that I recognized. I stood up and carefully followed the humming. A familiar blue light shone from across the hallway, and I dismissed it, choosing to follow the lead of the song, but all the while that light, that familiar blue light, was brewing a storm in my thoughts. And the moment that I entered the bathroom, it hit me. The light was from a lamp that Dan had been given on his birthday. This was the night that my mother died. My mother when I was Ellen. She stopped her humming as soon as she noticed my presence. "You came," she said, so softly that I didn't realize she had until I heard her continue. "Hold my hand." I went over to her. I wanted to ask her if she could see me and what was going on. She could be my source of comfort in whatever was happening right now, but like I said, my heart was growing colder and darker. I stopped feeling anything. I held her hand. Her touch did something to me. Something that made wrinkles go up my arm and cracks form on my skin. I felt a terrible pain in my body, or whatever my form was right now, as it shifted and broke down into something frail and decayed. I barely had a chance to say another word. My mother said, looking into my eyes. What the reflection in the water showed me was a monster. A decaying, rotting corpse. Something that I had once seen in a vision as I passed out on the road. Something that looked like it belonged in a nightmare. A walking corpse. "I'm sorry." She pushed herself down into the water, remaining absolutely still. I think that somewhere there was a part of me where Ellen still lived. A part which hadn't completely transformed into whatever it is I was now. A part which was horrified and screaming, clawing and begging for it to stop. That part of me was dying, and so was its influence. I felt another strong pull, and I was pushed down into that dark corner of this house. I forced myself out of the corner and walked past towards the bathroom. Every step I took caused such terrible pains that I don't think would have been possible to experience had I been alive. The blue light now illuminated my appearance, and Dan looked at me with a terrified look. I wanted to say something to him to comfort him, but I had to keep going. I entered the bathroom. I saw a glimpse of a moment as my mother gripped the sides of the bathtub with her hands, her body twitching and struggling. She flipped herself over in the water, the moment that she reached near unconsciousness. Before I could do anything, I found myself back in that dark corner. I tried to step out of it again, and this time I went into my parents' room, this time in hopes of getting into that darkness again. Maybe Jim would be able to see me now. The pain had to be endured. For a moment, it did seem to work, but this time I saw Jim a bit older. He was in his dorm. His eyes had dark bags formed under them. His mouth was stuffed with a white rag. He had a knife in his hand, and he was frantically looking around the room as if he was paranoid about something. He looked pale and skinny. I wanted to reach out to him. I felt nothing as I did this. I felt as if I had no reason to do it. But the pain kept me going. In my head, I had made promises to myself that if I do succeed in whatever I was doing, the pain would go away. "Jim," I said through gargles as I reached him. Jim smiled, but not at me. He plunged the knife into his finger and began to hack away. I turned away from him and found myself back in the old house. This time in a different time. Dan was there, much younger than before, 11 or 10 at the time. He looked at me once again, and his expression turned to fear. I tried to talk, regardless of how it felt when I tried, regardless of the pain. But Dan, in his fear, passed out, and I let go, finding myself back at that dark corner. I was trapped. Whatever my mother had done, it had trapped me here. I looked down at my hands, old, wrinkly, aged, cracked, decaying. I was such a monstrosity to look upon. No wonder I got no help. I needed to do something about this. I don't know what, but I had to. I sat there in the corner, watching time go by. No jumping around this time. It was straight and linear. I watched Dan go through shock as I relived the night my mother had died, this time as an observer. I watched my dad go through grief, blaming himself in a way for this. Most disturbing of all was watching myself. When I had been Ellen and not this ghost, a prisoner of this house. Young Ellen had no idea what was about to happen to her. I wanted to warn her, to help her, but I knew that in the end, it was futile. I watched the house empty, and the memories be the only inhabitants roaming its empty halls. A dark memory, that of grief and tragedy, overshadowed any happiness that was here. I had accepted my prison. I wished for insanity. I wished for anything that would take my mind away. Was this how death was? Was this how it had always been? Then, someone came into the house. The emptiness was disturbed by a presence. A boy. Someone who was about Dan's age when my mom had died and left me confined into this hell. This boy had a knife, and it was bloodied. It dripped as he came up the stairs. I almost would have thought that he was coming towards me. As he passed by me, I gripped at his feet and saw through him. Marcus. I knew his name. I wanted to tell him things about my past, about where I was, but I couldn't. I knew that the moment he saw me, he would run away in fear, but he didn't. He didn't even see me. "Who's there?" he asked. He then giggled a bit. There was something wrong with him. He put something to his lips out of his pocket and drew in a long breath. "Who?" he said, feeling drowsier and tipsier. He sat down, a bloody knife in hand, and fell asleep. We were in another world. A room which was comically large. Marcus was screaming as a man pushed his fist into the side of the boy's cheek. Marcus screamed and wailed as the man hit him harder and harder. The man then picked him up and smashed his head against a mirror, but this made no sense. Something about this was strange. This was a dream. I was in his dream. I saw myself in his dream through the mirror. If I could feel anything then, it would have been disgust. Marcus was sobbing harder. I could smell, almost taste his fear in the air. I walked, feeling no pain, to that man and tried to push him off. When my skin touched his, he began to melt away. This was a dream. Marcus looked up at me, and for the first time, instead of fear, he smiled gratefully. He woke up, and so did I, and we left this house. I was still confined to the house, but a part of me lived on through his dreams. The memories of the past stopped there, and a gunshot rang the second time. Billy stood next to a corpse in the snow, blood gushing out of its neck and staining the white terrain. Its face was horribly disfigured, but nothing that Billy did. It was one of the skinned. Billy panted, and then moved to the other side of the car. The window was shattered with a bullet hole in the middle of it. "Ellen, don't." I heard a distant voice, somewhere from someone who saw me, the only person who had known I was there. It's the only way to take the king down, Ellen. Sharon stood in front of me. Someone that I had taken as my mother. Someone who had deliberately done something to confine me into her form while she took mine. She was completely naked, but her skin, unlike mine, was still ageless. Billy pulled the other car door open, and out fell another corpse, with a fresh bullet hole piercing through its temple. This one was skinned, too. Billy sighed, looking down on the corpses in disgust. He had dreamed about the skinned. He had dreamed about them taking over the town and skinning every last man and woman and child. A similar dream that Byrne and Terrence, the two boys responsible for the invader shooting, had seen. A dream in which I finally met the skinned witch. Marcus had been sleeping better lately. He was going to Zachary Levitt's rehab. Through his dreams, I tried to learn more about the secrets of this place, but there was someone else around here. Someone else in his dreams. Zachary hung around a local diner at times, trying to avoid the rather trashier spots in this town. And there, I knew when he met Terrence Greggs that it was no coincidence. In Marcus's dream, he was back at the rehab, sharing circle. But everyone seemed to be puppets. All except him. The rest of them had strings attached going all the way through and about them, and it didn't take long for the puppeteer to arrive. Sharon Vale, my mother. Of course, by now, my appearance had been worse than before as I decayed with time. I tried to speak, but my words began to gargle with blood again. I am, she said perfectly. I have done this so many times that I can withstand the pain. The water chokes me when I speak, but you do learn to power through that. If you've done it a million times, you'll figure it out too. You're a part of me. I went up to her, my body moving slowly, and I touched her. If I could feel, I would be feeling fear. You're the skinned witch, I said through my touch. We are. You and me. I just needed you to wait here. You're wearing my pain and my fear. The king can't have it, and he can't use me. It's with you, and you need to stay back at the house. I felt her reply. What are you doing here? I asked. This boy and his friend will have to kill Dan. The king will get him after he gets into police custody. He has a part of me too, and I cannot afford that to happen. Why would the police take him? I asked. I'm sorry, she replied. You'll find yourself back at the house when Marcus dies. Don't fight it. I have nothing against Dan. I tried to warn him. It could have been him in your place, but you died somewhere far ahead of my own death. Somewhere I couldn't see. She had a trap for both of us. The only reason I was here and not completely dead was because I had a part of the skinned witch in me. Our conversation ended, and she left. Marcus woke back up, and this time he found himself in the rehab, sleeping on his chair, amongst other chairs arranged in the sharing circle. He was alone, oblivious to the conversation I had had with Sharon. There was a familiar time wrapping darkness around somewhere near me, and I knew that it would get me back into the old house. I couldn't afford that. I had to stay here. He stood up confused, and he tried to leave, but the door was blocked by a tall man. A man with half of his face skinned. Startled, he stepped back, and a woman came into the room. Come with me, she spoke. She wore a lab coat, and her manner was comforting, almost as if she was oblivious to whatever was about to happen. And in that moment, as she put her hands on him, I reached out and touched her. Anna Levitt. Billy coughed, and I saw that the cat was still there. It didn't care for the cold as much as it did about the curiosity, but it wasn't looking at me. "Ellen, listen to me," Sharon said. "You can't do this. You fucking bitch, stop this right now." I didn't listen. I knew that speaking to her would just give her the higher ground. Her words turned sweet, and then just as bitter, and then sweet again, and then desperate begging. With ancient spells, the skinned witch burned her flesh, disappearing into another world. I wanted to tell her something. I was tempted to, but I couldn't. The man who had shot and killed me wasn't Jim, although I had no doubt that Jim felt so. It had been Billy. I knew that because I told him to do so. And in a while, after this was done, he would go and get straight to it. Billy pulled out a box from behind the car. He opened it. I knew that as much, as I felt emotionally numb, and I would regret seeing it later. Billy walked to his car and brought out a liter of gasoline, and I watched him douse the skin with it. Her screams and pleading became more frantic as Billy set the skin on fire. Her own skin began to decay away and age, and mine started to restore back to what it was like. "You were the skinned witch. Only you, and never me," I told Sharon. "That part of you that lives in me is Ellen, and it will always be Ellen." She disappeared frantically, presumably to go to the part of me who still lived in this time, and to get to that Ellen's child in her desperation for a host. She wouldn't find it. She was also trying to give Dan her finger, all in vain. She had confined the bearer of her skin to that house, and now she would be stuck there for a while, until someone else went in there. For a while, I suffered through Anna's dreams. She was a doctor, and she volunteered part-time at the rehab, but she was also living through a lifeless and dead marriage. Zachary was obsessed with his work at the rehab. She wanted to love him for it, but she couldn't. It was almost as if he wasn't merely working there, but he was living there. She didn't get what was going on down there in the rehab other than a few circle jerk sessions, as she called it, out of spite at times. She eventually stopped going down there, and she started to ignore Zachary altogether. He didn't care, though. His life and his passion had all been stolen by the rehab. She wanted to find some solace with her adopted daughter, Marion, but she was another bitter reminder of the colorless reality she currently lived in. Marion's mother was also in the same rehab, and after she had lost custody, the Levitts had taken her, in what was mostly a publicity-motivated move for the image of the rehab. At night, I watched her as she enjoyed the only passionate moments of her life in sexually charged dreams. In the days she woke up, still frustrated, and then felt ashamed and uneasy, as if people could see into her thoughts and the dreams that she saw about them. Most of all, her patients and coworkers. And then, one day, she had a new patient, Daniel Vale, who was also a prime suspect in the disappearance of his own aunt. The first time she heard, it almost excited her. She fantasized about this dangerous man. If I could feel anything, it would have been disgust, because in another life, that man had been my brother. But this was also the perfect opportunity for me to get to Dan. Billy sat in the car and began to drive. I had to do whatever it took to sort this out tonight. If not, I risked the skinned witch coming back with a vengeance, or the Winter King getting them. I honestly did not know which would have been worse. He had shot Ellen down from up on a hill. He had to, despite how he felt about it. If I didn't die and go through what I did, the skinned witch would still be out there doing fuck knows what. I was sad. Terribly sad. My feelings began to come back soon after I sent the skinned witch away. It had to make him shoot me down, knowing full well that I would lose Jim, Dan, and my dad. I would have wept had I been alive. Oh, I would have wept terribly. He sat in the car for a long time in silence. He was breathing heavily. He knew that what he did was technically wrong, very wrong, and yet he knew that he had to do it. So far, everything I had showed him in his dreams had been right, and there was no way this wasn't something he had to do as well. But this time, there was no way of him seeing what would have come beyond my death, so, like I said before, I had to wait and hope that everything was to go the way that I had planned. I couldn't do anything to make him snap out of it. I just hoped he would come to on his own. I didn't know if I could influence anyone else anymore, or even if I could, I didn't know how effective it would have been. I had to go down and watch. Dan had been seen entering the old house. Marcus Piper's skull had been found there, and I felt hints of guilt. The doctor, thankfully, did see Dan in person despite her shame. It wasn't easy to get into his dreams. See, he had a part of the skinned witch in him as well, and she was careful that it wasn't going to be easy to influence him. But I knew my brother well enough to tell that he was occupied with thoughts of Aunt Greta most probably, and the finger that Sharon had given him in the dream when she carefully placed it there. The thing that would reach the cops and hopefully get to someone who was amongst the skinned, the people who followed the king. I hadn't figured it out by then, but I had been foolish to assume that it was the last that I had seen of my mother, the skinned witch. The nurse, she had been with the nurse all along. That was when we met for the second time. Anna had fallen asleep on the counter, dreaming dreadful things about my brother and her. And it went dark, and I found myself within that realm of snow, a wintry landscape. There was a puddle of blood on the ground, and next to it stood my mother. I went to her and placed a hand on her. "I won't let you hurt him." "I won't," she spoke. "Now that the finger has gone away, though, you can have him for all I care." "The finger? The station is full of Zachary's friends. You know that." She nodded and smiled, almost proud. "Why are you taking this so far? Why are you playing with our lives?" I said, surprising myself. I was emotionally numb, but I felt the hints of something. Anger? She never answered me. She left. She anticipated to draw the king out with that finger. She knew that he was near Zachary somewhere, but she hadn't found him yet. I knew that Anna knew nothing. Where else could she be? Who else would be close to the finger and yet work at the police and somehow be near Dan as well? My dad. She was trying to influence him. If I could feel something, it would have been horror. Unsurprisingly, that night, death came for Dan, disguised as two random shooters. When I left Billy and went down to the car with Dan, Jim, and my dad, I tried to avert my eyes from my own lifeless corpse. Dan rushed the car forward, crushing the suited, skinned man standing ahead of him. The car stopped, and Dan got out of the car and started shooting at the other skinned. I could feel things, and I felt anxious. "Dan," a familiar voice called out, and he turned to find the skinned woman standing next to the car behind him. Dan. I recognized that voice, and so did he. "Aunt Greta?" Dan said. Skinned and unskinned men and women alike emerged from the sides of the road and caught Dan unaware. The tall, half-skinned man punched him, knocking him to the ground. My dad fell out of his seat, and when a skinned man tried to turn him over, he shot the man's face off with his gun, which was concealed in his grip. These people had no regard for their own lives. They had been throwing it away. They didn't fear anything. They had given it all to the king. Jim was absolutely feral. He was attacking everything in sight, left and right. He let out a scream and he was torn apart with guilt. I had no way to let him know that this wasn't his fault. And then, my blood ran cold as I heard something I had never heard before, but I had heard the story enough times to know what it was. The half-skinned man sat Dan down. I really hoped that Billy would come to his senses soon. Maybe I should have let the skinned witch do it. Maybe I should have let her kill them. Maybe it would have been painless and... no, I told myself. She wasn't better than any of this. I would save them. I would save them. Even though I could do nothing to stop them from coming out here, lured by something the skinned witch planned to draw the king out, it did work. And he did come out, except I didn't know what to do or what to expect. The skinned witch, my mother, Sharon Vale, had anticipated most of this, but what she hadn't anticipated was me willingly letting myself die to suffer it all again. She couldn't see past her death, and even if she could, she would imagine after all that she had put me through, I would want myself to live. She also hadn't anticipated Dan leaping through the window. He wasn't supposed to. He was supposed to die then, but he outdid his own fear. Before the shootings began, I felt another presence in there. Something that was neither mine nor Sharon's. I could only imagine what it was, but it was what made him want to draw his fear away and towards the house. The house where something waited for him. I slipped in through that dream and found myself grabbing on to Aunt Greta. We were in that house again, and I realized with horror what this was supposed to be. Whoever had placed Marcus's head there wanted him back to the house. Apparently, they had learned a lot from Marcus's dreams, and now they tried to lure me into that prison along with Dan. This is why I was able to get to him. I tried to escape, and I found myself back with Anna Levitt, who was out of the building before the shooting began. I was familiar with her, and I was lucky that she had survived, but Anna wouldn't do anything. Her dreams and desires were too strong for me to influence, and I had to get away, as much as I could, from anyone the king's influence reached. He almost got me back to that house. Letting Dan go would have made me feel regret, but for now, I was going to stick with Anna. But the moment the police came in to question her, I recognized the officer who came in to talk to her. Someone I could maybe put my faith in. Someone I could use to help my dad and maybe find out more about this king. And so, that night, Billy saw an unusual dream. Now he was up on the hill, shocked that he had actually killed someone innocent this time. Down here, Jim, Dan, and my dad were down on their knees. A well-dressed man sat on the hood of the car, and his face was concealed with white cloth, sticking to his head with blood, leaving only his bulging eyes, which were red, like tiny exposed patches of skin. It was skinned. "Dan, do you remember me?" Zachary said. He gestured for something, and the half-skinned man picked my dad up. "No? And him? You do know him, don't you?" He spoke. "Your tormentor. He blamed you for your mother's death, and he gave you hell for it too, as far as I know. He was in charge here for sure, but he wasn't the king. Though I felt his presence too. I kept hoping for Billy to spring into action and shoot this son of a bitch. "Dan," Zachary said, "kill me. I deserve it for all that I did to you." He handed Dan a blade. "This man is a terrible father. Quite like mine, but I don't feel so bad." The half-skinned man's grip tightened on my dad's collar. Should I have let the skinned witch handle this? Should I have let her do it? He actually let the police believe that you killed Greta. And as you can see, she's right here, courtesy of our patrolman. If you have anything to say, Zachary said to my dad, say it now. My dad sighed. Jim stood up and tried to take down the half-skinned man. I watched in terror as he held Jim and crushed his throat with his other hand immediately. I held myself together, watching silently. I would have wept. I would have wept. My dad, anxious but gritting his teeth, looked at Dan. I blamed myself for her death. I know I was hard on you, son. I was wrong for it, he said. I love you, son. I loved Ellen. Sharon. He began to break down. His words were shaky, but he held himself together. They want you to cry. They want it because they want you to hurt, Dan. Don't give it to them. Do not give it to them. Dan opened his mouth to speak, but he froze in shock as the half-skinned man ripped open my dad's jaw barehanded, exposing red and yellow mush. There was a loud snap, and he fell, twitching. I wailed and screamed hard. I couldn't take it. This was my fault. I shouldn't have taken this on myself. I heard the roar again, and Zachary seemed excited. We have company, he declared, acknowledging my presence. I fell into that writhing darkness again, and I felt lost in it. But this time, I wasn't alone. Something was chasing me in here. I went back to the night Mom died, to Jim's parents telling him the story of the witch, to Tori Reed's house as she told the Skinned where we were heading, to my dad, held by the Skinned before Dan freed him, to the walk home from school. Everywhere I went, I was followed by that monstrous roar. And then, to the funeral home. My mother's corpse lay there, gray and long dead, but intact. She wasn't skinned. The growls got louder in the distance, echoing through the halls of the funeral home. You, I said, surprised. I didn't choke on blood. You're here. I am, my mother's body said back. Her mouth was the only part of her that moved. You wanted me here. You wanted me here. You wanted me here all along. I did. And now you're here. The growls grew louder in the distance as the king closed in. Skin me, she said. You can do it. You can do it, she replied. Skin me. This isn't the real world. This is a dream, Ellen. My dream. The darkness is my world, and the world the king comes from. It is the world which leads to the kingdom of winter. We can bind him here if you listen. How? I can't. He wants my pain, she said. Give it to him. How would I skin you? Your finger. Use it. The growls grew closer. Now I could hear from the echoes that the growls were followed by something that crawled and writhed around. I don't imagine from that sound that these were footsteps. I pressed my finger into her skin and pulled back globs of flesh. Don't look, she said to me. I obeyed. I kept pulling until I had my hands full of flesh. In there, I felt the pain of the skinned witch, of the loved ones that she had lost all throughout time, of the towns and cities, of worlds where she would inevitably fall in love with someone just to have them taken away, of leaving us, of my death and the pain of Stan's death. She would have wept, or maybe she already was. I couldn't tell. I held her pain in my hands now, and the growl came from right behind me. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel the writhing and wriggling presence of countless appendages in the room. I felt tiny feelers crawl on my arms, cold as ice, slimy as it took the flesh away. I wept. I wept and wept and wept and wept. I screamed and wailed, all with my eyes closed. I screamed for the death of my mother. I screamed for the Aunt Greta. I screamed for Jim, for my dad. And then the thing roared back in pain. The pain that the skinned witch carried all through its life was a pain the king had never known. The loss of a loved one would never plague someone who never loved anything, and such a pain in such magnitude began to shake it to its very core. I felt the being beg to no one as it screamed and died, madness consuming it. The funeral home began to crumble, and I knew that I had to protect my mother from this all. I risked opening my eyes as the darkness began to consume this place. I closed the coffin down on her. "Thank you," I muttered. The casket had a round hole in it, like a keyhole, and as the darkness consumed everything, I put my finger into it and felt it twist and snap. The king writhed behind me, and I knew that one look at the being would draw me to madness as well. I found myself in my world, standing next to Dan, who wasn't kneeling anymore. The skinned, all around us began to bleed more profusely as the white cloth concealing them began to drip. The king was desperately giving them their share of pain back in order to rid himself of it. They screamed, and some began to frantically tear at themselves from the sudden agony of what they had done. The half-skinned man, who didn't seem much affected by this, and tried to hide his own pain behind a stoic mask, tried to push Dan back down to his knees. A loud crack rang through the air as a bullet pierced the half-skinned man's head and dropped him to the ground. The ones who weren't skinned were being attacked by the skinned, and in this chaos, Zachary Levitt tried to run away, but failed when Dan tackled him to the ground. Another crack through the air, and Aunt Greta fell dead. Zachary screamed in agony as Dan's fist came down on him over and over and over again. His first tormentor, Zachary, writhed like an insect. Another crack, and another one of the skinned fell. This time, the shooter came closer. Billy. Zachary's eyes burst and his teeth fell in, but only when he had absolutely stopped moving and Dan had mashed his face down to a pulp did he stop to shout, a primal roar in agony. He stood up and watched as the chaos unfolded. Crack, crack, crack. Billy put a bullet in each of the skinned, and then put his gun to Dan. Dan's arms hung lifeless, his fist bloody and his eyes tired and raged. Billy nodded to Dan and continued his shooting. Dan began to walk and move forward on the road, purposeless and lost. Grieving and mad, he danced on the edge of insanity. He paused for a moment. A few more cracks rang out in the wind. A cat had made its way into his path and looked up at me. I placed a hand on his shoulder, and I saw images of his time. I saw him escape a car wreck from when the king almost got him. I saw him living on the run out of town. I saw him living on scraps, and I felt a touch of Mom in him. She wasn't here, but part of her was. He bent down, and with trembling hands he touched the cat on the head. Then it pounced away. He turned back to face my direction, and for a moment I thought he could see me. He couldn't, but he felt it. I wanted to hold him in one final embrace, but barely felt anything now. My vision began to fade. I love you, I said. My words weren't held by the gargling blood anymore. A tear left his eye, and he nodded as the wind whispered to him. Finally, with my purpose served, I began to imagine the life that I always wanted, as I started to fade into nothing. I imagined the children that me and Jim would have had. I imagined Dan having kids of his own. I imagined my dad old, taking my children on vacations. I imagined lying in Jim's arms as we grew old together. And I imagined the curve of my mother's smile. I imagined Dan's birthday and giving him that blue lamp. As I faded away, I imagined holding him in an embrace. But it wasn't awkward. It was sincere, and the tightest, warmest hug that I could possibly give my brother. And as long as I existed, I wouldn't let go. So that was the overall finale of Winter Kingdom. Winter Kingdom Part 8, finale, The Skinned Witch by Aakash Sharma. Aakash, a huge thank you, man. You are an amazing author. Raventown was fantastic. This one was just absolutely mind-blowing. You always do a fantastic job in your stories and your series, so I just want to say thank you again, man. I really, really do appreciate it, and kudos, because just damn. If you all enjoyed this series and want more content like this, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Just hit the subscribe button, the bell icon next to it. You can also follow me on social media platforms, support through Patreon, Coffee, channel memberships, etc. I'm not going to do a word of the day for this video. I'm going to try to keep that to the true story collection, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so you won't see those in the fiction stories. So anyway, alright everyone, I hope you have a beautiful day and a wonderful weekend. I will see you on Monday with another video, but until then, of course, sleep well.